Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet suburbs of America, where manicured lawns meet white picket fences, darkness sometimes takes root in the most unexpected places. Tonight, we delve into a story that began with teenage romance in the early days of the internet, evolved into a disturbing tale of manipulation and control, and ended in tragedy across 3 states. This is the case of Katie and Stephen Plattle, a story that challenges our understanding of family, power, and the devastating consequences when both are corrupted. The year was 1995. The internet was still in its infancy, dial-up modems sang their electronic songs, and chat rooms were the new frontier for human connection. It was in this digital landscape that 20-year-old Stephen Walter Plattle first encountered 15-year-old Alyssa Garcia. She was just a teenager in San Antonio, Texas, exploring this new world of online communication, when she stumbled into a conversation that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. Stephen was charming in the way that predators often are. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to make a young girl feel special, important, desired. Within days of their first online exchange, he had convinced Alyssa that what they had was real, that age was just a number, that love conquered all obstacles. The manipulation was swift and decisive. Before anyone in her family knew what was happening, Alyssa had made the decision that would haunt her for decades to come. She ran away from her family home in Texas and traveled to New York to be with Stephen. She was 16 years old, still a child in the eyes of the law, but in Stephen's world, she was his possession, his prize, his conquest. The relationship was everything you might expect from such an unequal dynamic. Stephen was controlling, manipulative, and as Alyssa would later discover, capable of violence. But she was young, isolated from her family, and completely dependent on him. When she became pregnant at 16, there was no support system to help her, no escape route that seemed viable. On January 29, 1998, in the dead of winter, Alyssa gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Denise, a name that would soon disappear from official records, replaced by another as the child's fate took an unexpected turn. The birth should have been a moment of joy, but instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter of horror. According to Alyssa's later testimonies to authorities, Stephen's abusive nature revealed itself almost immediately after their daughter's birth. The same hands that had once caressed Alyssa in false tenderness now turned their cruelty toward an innocent infant. She described how Stephen would pinch the baby until she was black and blue, leaving marks on skin so delicate it seemed to bruise at the slightest touch. But the abuse escalated beyond simple pinching. In what can only be described as sociopathic behavior, Stephen would place the infant inside a cooler, a plastic container meant for keeping drinks cold at summer picnics, now being used as a torture device for a helpless child. The baby nearly suffocated on multiple occasions, her tiny lungs struggling for air in the confined, airless space. Alyssa watched in horror as the man she thought she loved revealed himself to be a monster. But she was trapped, financially dependent, emotionally manipulated, and terrified of what Stephen might do if she tried to leave. The isolation was complete. She had burned bridges with her family when she ran away, and now she found herself alone with a man whose capacity for cruelty seemed to know no bounds. As the abuse continued and escalated, Alyssa found herself facing an impossible decision. Every instinct screamed at her to protect her child, but every practical consideration told her she was powerless. Stephen held all the cards, the money, the housing, the control. She was barely 18 years old, with no education, no job prospects, and no family support system. It was in this context of desperation and fear that Alyssa made one of the most difficult decisions any mother could make. She couldn't protect her daughter from Stephen while they remained together, but perhaps she could save her by giving her a chance at a different life entirely. The decision to place the baby for adoption wasn't made lightly, it was made from a place of profound love and desperation. The adoptive family that welcomed baby Denise was everything Stephen and Alyssa were not. Kelly and Anthony Fusco were stable, loving, financially secure, and desperately wanting to give a child all the opportunities life could offer. They renamed the baby Katie Rose Fusco, and from the moment she entered their home, she was surrounded by the kind of love and stability that every child deserves. For Katie, the Fuscos weren't just adoptive parents, they were her parents in every way that mattered. Anthony worked as a dedicated professional, providing for his family, while Kelly created a warm, nurturing home environment. They lived in New Milford, Connecticut, a picturesque New England town where Katie could grow up safely, surrounded by good schools, friendly neighbors, and all the normal experiences of American childhood. As Katie grew from infant to toddler to young girl, she had no knowledge of the circumstances of her birth or the violence she had escaped. To her, the Fuscos were simply mom and dad, and their love for her was absolute and unconditional. She attended local schools, made friends, participated in activities, and lived the kind of normal, happy childhood that her biological parents had been incapable of providing. While Katie grew up in safety and love, Stephen and Alyssa's relationship continued to evolve in troubling ways. Eventually, despite everything that had happened, they married in 2006. It was a decision that speaks to the complex psychology of abuse, how victims sometimes remain tethered to their abusers through bonds that are difficult for outsiders to understand. Over the years, Stephen and Alyssa had 2 more daughters together. They settled in Richmond, Virginia, where they attempted to build what appeared from the outside to be a normal family life. Stephen worked, Alyssa cared for their children, and to neighbors and acquaintances, they probably seemed like any other suburban family dealing with the everyday challenges of raising children and paying bills. But those who knew them well understood that Stephen hadn't changed. His controlling nature, his tendency toward manipulation, his capacity for cruelty, these fundamental aspects of his personality remained constant. The marriage was built on a foundation of trauma and control, and while it may have had periods of stability, it was never truly healthy. As their daughters grew older, the dynamics in the household became increasingly strained. Stephen's need for control extended to every aspect of family life, and Alyssa found herself walking on eggshells, trying to maintain peace while protecting her children from the worst of his behaviors. The house in Richmond became a pressure cooker, with tensions building year after year. Meanwhile, in Connecticut, Katie was thriving. She was intelligent, outgoing, and well-adjusted, a testament to the loving environment the Fuscos had created. As she entered her teenage years, she began to show curiosity about her origins, asking the questions that many adoptees ask: where did I come from? Who are my biological parents? What's my story? When Katie turned 18 in 2016, she made the decision that countless adoptees make: she wanted to connect with her biological parents. It's a natural human desire to understand one's origins, to fill in the missing pieces of one's identity. For Katie, who had been loved and well cared for her entire life, this wasn't about finding something she was missing, but rather about understanding the complete picture of who she was. The reunion was arranged through proper channels, and Katie's first meeting with Stephen and Alyssa was everything she might have hoped for. They were welcoming, warm, and seemed genuinely thrilled to reconnect with the daughter they had given up nearly 2 decades earlier. Stephen, in particular, appeared to be delighted by Katie's presence in their lives. What Katie couldn't have known was that her arrival represented something very different to Stephen than it did to her. Where she saw an opportunity to understand her past and perhaps build a relationship with her biological parents, Stephen saw something else entirely: an opportunity for what would become the ultimate expression of his need for control and domination. The family dynamics shifted almost immediately upon Katie's arrival. Stephen began paying an unusual amount of attention to his biological daughter, showing an interest that went beyond normal parental affection. He was fascinated by her, drawn to her in ways that made Alyssa deeply uncomfortable but that she initially couldn't quite articulate. Katie, for her part, was simply happy to have found her biological family. She had grown up with questions about where she came from, and now she had answers. She began spending more time with Stephen and Alyssa, getting to know her half-sisters, and trying to understand her place in this newly expanded family structure. What happened next defies easy explanation and ventures into territory that challenges our most basic understanding of family relationships. Somewhere in the process of getting to know each other, the relationship between Stephen and Katie began to evolve beyond what anyone would consider appropriate between a father and daughter. The concept of genetic sexual attraction is well documented in psychological literature. It describes the phenomenon where close relatives who meet for the first time as adults sometimes experience inappropriate sexual attraction. However, what happened between Stephen and Katie went far beyond this recognized phenomenon. This was not a case of mutual confusion between two adults meeting for the first time. This was a case of a man with a documented history of grooming and manipulating young women, applying those same tactics to his own biological daughter. Stephen began treating Katie differently than he treated his other daughters. He showered her with attention, gifts, and affection that crossed boundaries. He made her feel special, chosen, unique, the same manipulation tactics he had used on Alyssa 20 years earlier when she was just 15 years old. Katie, who had grown up in a healthy family environment, initially didn't recognize these behaviors as manipulation. To her, this was simply her biological father trying to make up for lost time, showing her the love he hadn't been able to give her during her childhood. She was vulnerable in ways she didn't understand, eager to please, desperate to belong, and completely unprepared for the kind of sophisticated psychological manipulation that Stephen had spent decades perfecting. Alyssa watched this dynamic develop with growing horror and recognition. She had been exactly where Katie was now, young, vulnerable, and targeted by Stephen's calculated charm. But she was also trapped by her own complicated relationship with Stephen and her fear of what might happen if she tried to interfere. The parallels between her own experience and what she was witnessing must have been devastating to observe. As 2016 progressed into 2017, the relationship between Stephen and Katie crossed every conceivable boundary. What had begun as a father-daughter reunion evolved into something that violates every social, legal, and moral standard our society upholds. The manipulation was complete, and Katie, who had never experienced anything like Stephen's particular brand of psychological control, found herself caught in a web she didn't understand and couldn't escape. The other members of the family watched this unfold with varying degrees of awareness and horror. Alyssa knew exactly what was happening. She had lived through Stephen's manipulation herself, but she was trapped by her own fear and dependency. Katie's half-sisters were too young to fully understand the dynamics at play, but they could sense that something in their household had fundamentally changed. By early 2017, the relationship between Stephen and Katie had become sexual. This wasn't a case of two consenting adults making a choice. This was a case of an experienced predator systematically grooming and manipulating a young woman who had been raised to trust and respect parental authority. The power imbalance was complete. Stephen was older, more experienced, and held all the psychological cards. As the relationship progressed, Stephen made increasingly bold moves. He convinced Katie that what they had was special, that it was love in its purest form, that society simply couldn't understand the connection they shared. He isolated her from other relationships, made her dependent on his approval, and created an environment where she felt that pleasing him was her primary purpose. The manipulation was so complete that when Stephen suggested they should be together permanently, Katie agreed. When he suggested they should marry, she said yes. When he convinced her that their love was so pure and natural that they should have a child together, she didn't resist. Every step of the way, Stephen was the architect of decisions that Katie believed she was making freely. On July 20, 2017, just 2 months after Stephen's divorce from Alyssa was finalized, something happened that defies belief. Stephen Plattel married his own biological daughter, Katie Rose Fusco Plattel, in Parkton, Maryland. To make this legal abomination possible, they lied on their marriage application, claiming to be unrelated individuals with the right to marry. The ceremony itself was a study in contradiction and denial. Present were Stephen's mother, who somehow rationalized witnessing her son marry his own daughter, and Katie's adoptive parents, Kelly and Anthony Fusco, who had raised her with love and care, only to watch her make this devastating choice. The photographs from that day show people going through the motions of celebration while participating in something that violated every natural law of family relationships. For the Fuscos, this must have been particularly heartbreaking. They had given Katie everything they had: love, stability, opportunities, education, and now they were watching her throw her life away in the most incomprehensible manner possible. But they were also parents who loved their daughter unconditionally, and even in their horror and confusion, they couldn't abandon her entirely. The marriage was, of course, illegal under both Virginia and North Carolina law, where incest is a felony. But Stephen and Katie were living in a bubble of delusion, convinced that their love transcended such mundane considerations as law and social convention. They moved to a house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Knightdale, North Carolina, just east of Raleigh, and began playing house as husband and wife. To their neighbors, they probably appeared to be a normal young couple, perhaps with an unusual age gap, but nothing that would raise immediate suspicions. Stephen was 42 years old, Katie was 20. To casual observers, they might have seemed like a May-December romance, unusual but not necessarily scandalous. Only those who knew the truth understood the full horror of what was actually happening. In September 2017, Katie gave birth to a son. They named him Bennett, an innocent child born into circumstances that no child should ever have to bear. Bennett was simultaneously Katie's son and her half-brother, Stephen's son and grandson. The family tree had become so twisted as to be unrecognizable. The birth of Bennett should have been a moment of joy, but instead it represented the full culmination of Stephen's manipulation and control. He had now achieved what may have been his ultimate goal: complete dominance over a young woman who had been programmed to see him as both father and husband, combined with the creation of a child who would tie her to him forever. Katie, meanwhile, was struggling with the reality of her situation. The birth of a child often brings clarity to new mothers, and as she held Bennett in her arms, she began to see her circumstances more clearly. The fog of manipulation was beginning to lift, and she was starting to understand the true nature of what had happened to her. The isolation in their Knightdale home was profound. Katie was cut off from her adoptive parents, who were horrified by her choices but still loved her desperately. She was separated from any normal social circle, as her situation was too abnormal to explain or maintain casual relationships. Stephen was her entire world, just as he had intended. But even the most sophisticated manipulation campaigns can't completely suppress natural human instincts forever. Deep down, Katie was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with her life. The birth of Bennett served as a catalyst for this awakening, forcing her to confront questions about what kind of life she was creating for her child. By January 2018, the authorities had become aware of Stephen and Katie's situation. Whether through anonymous tips, family reports, or routine investigations, the law enforcement machinery had begun to turn. The charges were serious: incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. These weren't minor infractions, they were felonies that carried significant prison time. On a cold January morning, police officers arrived at the house on the cul-de-sac in Knightdale and arrested both Stephen and Katie. The facade of normalcy was shattered in an instant, replaced by the harsh reality of legal consequences for their actions. 7-month-old Bennett was placed in the custody of Stephen's mother, while his parents faced the justice system. The arrest was a wake-up call for Katie. For the first time since reconnecting with Stephen, she was physically separated from his influence and able to think clearly about her situation. In jail, Away from Stephen's constant manipulation and psychological control, she began to see her circumstances with new eyes. The legal system moved slowly but deliberately. Both Stephen and Katie were released on bond, but with strict conditions. They were ordered to have no contact with each other. Stephen returned to North Carolina, while Katie made the decision that would ultimately seal their fate. She chose to return to Connecticut, to the safety and sanity of her adoptive family. For the first time in months, Katie was back in an environment where she was loved unconditionally without manipulation, where people genuinely cared about her well-being rather than their ability to control her. The Fuscos, despite everything that had happened, welcomed their daughter home and began the long process of helping her heal from the psychological trauma she had endured. Being separated from Katie and losing control over her was something Stephen was psychologically unprepared to handle. His entire relationship with her had been built on manipulation and dominance, and now, for the first time since her 18th birthday, she was beyond his reach. The court order prohibiting contact meant that his usual methods of psychological control were no longer available to him. In Connecticut, Katie was rediscovering who she was outside of Stephen's influence. With the support of her adoptive family and likely professional counseling, she was beginning to understand the true nature of what had happened to her. She was recognizing the manipulation, understanding the grooming process, and coming to terms with the fact that what she had believed was love was actually sophisticated psychological abuse. This awakening led Katie to make a decision that was both brave and potentially dangerous. She decided to end her marriage to Stephen. In early April 2018, she contacted him to inform him that she wanted out of their relationship, that she was done with their marriage, and that she intended to move forward with her life without him. For Stephen, this was the ultimate loss of control. The young woman he had spent 2 years systematically manipulating and dominating was asserting her independence and rejecting him. It was a psychological blow that his narcissistic and controlling personality could not accept. If he couldn't have Katie on his terms, he would make sure that no one could have her at all. The phone call that ended their relationship was likely the trigger for what came next. Stephen's response to rejection was not acceptance or even anger. It was a calculated decision to ensure that if he couldn't control Katie's life, he would control her death. On the morning of April 12, 2018, Stephen Plattel began what would be his final day of life, and tragically, the final day for 3 other innocent people. His plan was methodical, spanning multiple states, and designed to inflict maximum devastation on those he blamed for his loss of control. His first stop was Knightdale, North Carolina, where 7-month-old Bennett was staying with Stephen's mother. The baby, his son and grandson, an innocent child who represented the physical manifestation of Stephen's manipulative triumph, became his first victim. The details of what happened in that house are almost too horrific to speak, but the result was the death of an infant who had never had a chance at a normal life. After murdering his own child, Stephen left a note for his mother explaining his actions. The note reportedly detailed his intentions for the rest of the day and expressed his belief that everyone who had betrayed him would pay the ultimate price. He then began a drive that would take him from North Carolina to Connecticut, a journey of over 500 miles, giving him plenty of time to consider his actions and change course. He chose not to. While Stephen was driving north, Katie was going about her day in New Milford, Connecticut, trying to rebuild her life and move forward from the nightmare of the previous 2 years. She was staying with her adoptive parents, the people who had loved and protected her throughout her childhood, and who were now doing everything they could to help her heal from the trauma she had endured. Anthony Fusco, Katie's adoptive father, was a man who had given his entire adult life to loving and caring for a daughter he had chosen to make his own. He had watched her grow from an abused infant into a bright, capable young woman. He had suffered through the horror of watching her fall under Stephen's influence, and now he was helping her find her way back to safety and sanity. Stephen's drive from North Carolina to Connecticut took most of the day. During those long hours behind the wheel, he had ample opportunity to reconsider his plan, to turn around, to choose a different path. But his narcissistic rage and inability to accept the loss of control over Katie drove him forward. In his mind, Everyone who had contributed to his loss of dominance over her deserved to die. He arrived in New Milford in the late afternoon and located Katie and Anthony Fusco. The exact circumstances of the confrontation aren't fully known, but the result was swift and brutal. Stephen shot and killed both Katie, the daughter he had manipulated and controlled, and Anthony Fusco, the man who had given her 20 years of genuine love and protection. In those final moments, Katie's life came full circle in the most tragic way possible. She had been born to Stephen and Alyssa under circumstances of abuse and violence, rescued by the Fuscos and given a chance at a normal life, manipulated back into Stephen's sphere of control, and finally murdered by the same man who had nearly killed her as an infant 20 years earlier. Anthony Fusco died trying to protect the daughter he loved. His final act was likely an attempt to shield Katie from Stephen's violence, just as he had shielded her from Stephen's abuse by adopting her as an infant. The man who had given her life its best years died trying to save her from the man who had given her life its worst moments. After murdering Katie and Anthony, Stephen fled the scene and began driving back toward Virginia. But his plan was not yet complete. He had taken the lives of his infant son, his daughter-wife, and her adoptive father, but there was still one more person he intended to punish: himself. Hours later, on a highway in Dover, New York, Stephen Walter Plattle's rampage came to an end in the way such rampages often do, with his own death by suicide. Police found him in his vehicle, having turned the gun on himself as law enforcement closed in. His death ended a spree of violence that had claimed 4 lives across 3 states and left countless others devastated by trauma and loss. The final death toll was staggering in its scope and senselessness. Bennett Plattle, 7 months old, murdered by his father-grandfather. Katie Rose Fusco Plattle, 20 years old, murdered by her father-husband. Anthony Charles Fusco, 56 years old, murdered while protecting his adoptive daughter. And Stephen Walter Plattle, 43 years old, dead by his own hand after orchestrating the destruction of multiple families. The ripple effects of Stephen's final act of violence spread far beyond the immediate victims. Alyssa Plattle lost her first child for the second time, first to adoption when she was 18 and desperate, and now to murder when that same child was 20 and trying to escape the cycle of abuse that had defined her origins. She also lost the infant grandson she had been caring for, and lived with the knowledge that the man she had been married to was capable of such unspeakable violence. Kelly Fusco lost both her daughter and her husband in a single act of violence. The woman who had opened her heart and home to an abused infant 20 years earlier was now left to grieve both the child she had raised and the man she had shared her life with. The family that had been built on love and hope was shattered by the very violence they had tried to protect Katie from. Stephen's mother, who had custody of Bennett when Stephen murdered him, was left to process the fact that her son had not only engaged in an incestuous relationship with his daughter but had ultimately murdered both that daughter and their child. The grandmother who had attended Stephen and Katie's wedding was now left to grapple with her own role in enabling and normalizing their relationship. The broader community was forced to confront questions about how such a thing could happen in their midst. How had the signs been missed? How had the manipulation been so complete? How had a system that was supposed to protect children failed so spectacularly? The case of Stephen and Katie Plattle challenges our most basic assumptions about family, love, and human nature. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some people are capable of manipulating and exploiting even the most sacred relationships for their own psychological gratification. Stephen Plattle was not a man who was overcome by inappropriate feelings. He was a predator who had spent his entire adult life grooming and manipulating young women. His relationship with Katie was not an aberration but rather the logical conclusion of a pattern that had begun when he first targeted 15-year-old Alyssa Garcia in 1995. The 23 years between first meeting Alyssa and murdering Katie represent a consistent pattern of seeking out vulnerable young women and exploiting their need for love and acceptance. Katie Plattle was not a willing participant in an inappropriate relationship. She was a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation by someone she had been programmed to trust and respect. Her story is a reminder that even intelligent, well-adjusted individuals can fall prey to manipulation when it comes from someone with the right combination of authority, charm, and psychological insight. The tragedy of this case lies not just in the deaths it produced, but in the years of manipulation and abuse that preceded those deaths. It's a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often not strangers lurking in shadows, but trusted figures who use their position and authority to exploit the vulnerable. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we carry with us the memory of Katie Rose Fusco Platel, who deserved so much better than the life and death she was given. We remember Anthony Fusco, who died as he had lived, protecting the daughter he loved. We remember 7-month-old Bennett, whose life was ended before it had truly begun. And we remember that even in the darkest of human stories, there are always those who choose love over control, protection over exploitation, and hope over despair. The Fuscos chose love when they adopted an abused infant and gave her 20 years of happiness and stability. That love, though it could not ultimately protect Katie from her biological father's violence, gave her the foundation she needed to recognize that violence for what it was and to try, however briefly, to escape from it. In the end, that may be the most important lesson from this tragic case, that love, real love, gives people the strength to recognize and resist manipulation, even when that recognition comes at great personal cost. Katie's final decision to leave Stephen and return to her adoptive family was an act of courage that cost her her life, but it was also an assertion of her own worth and agency in the face of years of psychological control. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to a seemingly ordinary hotel in Beaumont, Texas, where a routine business trip turned into one of the most puzzling locked-room mysteries in modern criminal history. This is the story of Gregory Joseph Flanagan, a 55-year-old businessman whose death in room 348 would baffle investigators for 9 long months. What appeared to be a natural death would reveal itself as something far more disturbing, hidden beneath the surface in the most unlikely of places. Gregory Joseph Flanagan was born on December 26, 1954, to Carol and Jane Flanagan. Greg, as everyone knew him, had built a successful life for himself in Lafayette, Louisiana. He was a landman, someone who negotiated oil and gas leases, working for OGM Land Company where he served as vice president. It was a business he co-owned with his brother, and it required extensive travel throughout Texas and Louisiana. Greg was a creature of habit, the kind of man who found comfort in routine. His work demanded that he spend weeks on the road, staying in hotels while he conducted business in various oil-rich regions. He had developed a particular fondness for the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. It wasn't just convenience that drew him there. Greg genuinely enjoyed the hotel's amenities and had become a familiar face to the staff. His routine was always the same. He would check into his room, usually requesting something on a higher floor when possible, call his wife Susie back home in Lafayette to let her know he'd arrived safely, order room service or pick up some snacks, and settle in for the evening with a movie or television show. It was a simple routine, but it brought him comfort during his long stretches away from home. Greg was well liked by his colleagues and had built strong relationships in the industry. He was known for his professionalism, his easygoing nature, and his dedication to his work. Those who knew him described him as a man who enjoyed life's simple pleasures, a good cigar, a cold drink, and the satisfaction of a job well done. On September 15, 2010, Greg was following this exact routine. He had checked into room 348 at the MCM Elegante Hotel, a room that would become synonymous with one of the most perplexing mysteries in Texas criminal history. The evening of September 15, 2010, began like countless others for Greg Flanagan. He had arrived at the MCM Elegante Hotel earlier that day, checked into room 348, and settled into his familiar routine. The hotel was a comfortable mid-range establishment that catered to business travelers like Greg, offering the amenities and service that made extended stays bearable. Greg's evening ritual was precise and comforting. First, he called Susie, his wife of many years, to check in. These nightly calls were sacred to their relationship, a way to maintain their connection despite the demands of his traveling job. Susie would later tell investigators that Greg sounded perfectly normal during their conversation that night, relaxed, perhaps a bit tired from the day's work, but in good spirits. After speaking with his wife, Greg decided to treat himself to some entertainment. He rented Iron Man 2 from the hotel's movie service, a film he'd been wanting to see. He also picked up some snacks from the hotel's convenience area, candy bars, soda, and cigarettes. Some accounts mention that he bought popcorn to microwave while watching the movie, planning a comfortable evening of relaxation. Greg changed into his pajamas, got comfortable on the bed, and started the movie. The room was set to his preferences, the air conditioning was turned off because Greg preferred a warmer room, and he had his cigarettes within reach. Everything was exactly as he liked it for a peaceful evening of unwinding after a long day of business. But then something went wrong with the electricity in his room. The combination of the television, the movie rental system, and the microwave running simultaneously proved too much for the room's electrical circuit. The circuit breaker tripped, plunging room 348 into darkness and cutting off power to Greg's entertainment for the evening. This electrical problem would prove to be far more significant than anyone could have imagined at the time. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would lead to Greg's death, though no one would understand the connection for months to come. When the power went out in room 348, Greg did what any hotel guest would do: he called the front desk to report the problem. The hotel's maintenance department was contacted, and they dispatched someone to fix the issue. This was routine maintenance, the kind of call that hotels receive dozens of times each week. Circuit breakers trip, electrical problems occur, and maintenance staff fix them. It should have been a 5-minute job, nothing more. The maintenance worker who responded to the call was someone the hotel knew well. He was an employee who had worked there for some time, handling various repairs and maintenance issues throughout the building. To the management and other staff, he seemed like a reliable worker who got the job done without fuss. What they didn't know, and what wouldn't come to light until much later, was that this maintenance worker was a registered sex offender. Lance Mueller, a 49-year-old man from Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, had a criminal history that the hotel was apparently unaware of when they hired him. This background would become crucial to understanding what happened next, though at the time, it was information hidden from view. Mueller arrived at room 348 to fix Greg's electrical problem. He would have knocked on the door, identified himself as maintenance, and been let into the room by Greg, who was eager to get his power restored so he could continue watching his movie. This was a completely normal interaction that happened hundreds of times in hotels across the country every single day. What transpired during those few minutes in room 348 would remain a mystery for almost 9 months. Mueller fixed the electrical problem, restoring power to Greg's room, and left. Or at least, that's what everyone assumed happened. The lights came back on, Greg could resume his movie, and the maintenance worker moved on to other tasks. But something else happened in that room, something that no one would discover until much later. The true nature of Mueller's visit to room 348 would only come to light through painstaking investigation and a crucial discovery that no one saw coming. The next morning, September 16, 2010, Greg Flanagan failed to check out of the hotel as scheduled. This wasn't entirely unusual. Business travelers sometimes extended their stays or checked out late, but when Greg didn't show up for work, his colleagues began to worry. Greg was nothing if not reliable. In all his years of traveling for business, he had never simply failed to appear without notice. He was the type of professional who communicated his schedule clearly and stuck to his commitments. When he didn't arrive at the expected time and couldn't be reached by phone, his co-workers knew something was wrong. Concerned colleagues made their way to the MCM Elegante Hotel to check on Greg. They spoke with hotel management, explaining that their colleague had failed to appear for important business meetings and wasn't answering his phone. The hotel staff, equally concerned, agreed to perform a welfare check on room 348. When they opened the door to Greg's room, they found a scene that was both mundane and tragic. Greg Flanagan was lying face down on the floor near his bed, still wearing his pajamas. The television was still on, flickering with the images from Iron Man 2. His cigarettes were nearby, and there was even still a cigarette gripped between his fingers. The air conditioning was off, just as Greg preferred it, but the room had grown uncomfortably warm overnight. The scene looked exactly like what it appeared to be, a middle-aged man who had suffered some kind of medical emergency while alone in his hotel room. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been in the room. The door had been locked from the inside, just as it should have been. Greg's wallet was still there with more than $1,000 in cash, untouched. His personal belongings were undisturbed. To everyone who saw the scene, including the responding police officers, this looked like a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. Middle-aged men, especially those with the stress of frequent travel and demanding jobs, sometimes suffered heart attacks or strokes. The fact that Greg was a smoker only reinforced this theory. When the Beaumont Police Department arrived at the scene, they found nothing to suggest foul play. Detective work begins with the most obvious explanation, and in this case, everything pointed to Greg having suffered a medical emergency. The room was secure, his belongings were intact, and there were no signs of violence or struggle. The initial police report reflected what seemed obvious to everyone involved: Gregory Flanagan had likely died of natural causes. Perhaps it was a heart attack brought on by stress and his smoking habit. Maybe it was a stroke. These things happened, especially to men in their 50s who lived high-stress lives and traveled frequently. Greg's body was transported to the Jefferson County morgue, where it would await an autopsy. This was standard procedure, but given the apparent circumstances of his death, it wasn't considered a high-priority investigation. There was no rush to process the scene for evidence because there didn't appear to be any evidence to process. The hotel room was cleaned and prepared for the next guest. Life went on at the MCM Elegante as it always had. The maintenance worker who had fixed Greg's electrical problem the night before continued with his regular duties. Everyone assumed that a sad but natural death had occurred, and that would be the end of the story. Greg's family was devastated but not suspicious. Sudden deaths, while shocking, are unfortunately not rare among middle-aged men. Susie Flanagan was heartbroken at the loss of her husband, but she had no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic twist of fate. Greg had seemed fine during their last phone conversation, but heart attacks can strike without warning. For weeks and then months, Greg Flanagan's death remained classified as a natural death. The case file was thin because there seemed to be no case to investigate. It appeared to be one of those sad reminders of human mortality, nothing more. But appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the truth is hidden in the most unexpected places. Dr. Tommy Brown, the medical examiner who conducted Greg Flanagan's autopsy, approached the procedure with the same thoroughness he brought to every case, regardless of how straightforward it appeared. While everyone expected the autopsy to confirm natural causes, Dr. Brown was trained to look for details that others might miss. The external examination revealed nothing unusual at first glance. Greg appeared to be a healthy middle-aged man with no obvious signs of trauma. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no obvious cause of death visible from the outside. Everything continued to point toward natural causes. But when Dr. Brown began the internal examination, he started to find things that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple heart attack or stroke. Greg's injuries were internal, and they were more severe than anyone had expected. He had suffered broken ribs, which was unusual for someone who had simply collapsed in a hotel room. There was a laceration to his liver, another injury that seemed inconsistent with a natural death. Most puzzling of all was what Dr. Brown found in Greg's scrotum, a small laceration that appeared as a bruise on the surface but represented something much more significant internally. This injury, combined with the broken ribs and liver damage, painted a picture of severe internal trauma that couldn't be explained by a simple medical episode. The most shocking discovery came when Dr. Brown examined Greg's heart. There, embedded in the cardiac tissue, was something that changed everything, a small hole that appeared to be caused by a foreign object. This wasn't the result of a heart attack or stroke. This was the result of something penetrating Greg's body with enough force to cause massive internal damage. Dr. Brown's conclusion was unavoidable and shocking: Gregory Joseph Flanagan had not died of natural causes. The evidence clearly indicated that he had been killed by some kind of projectile that had caused devastating internal injuries. The manner of death was changed from natural to homicide, and suddenly, what had seemed like a closed case became a murder investigation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Beaumont Police Department. They had a murder victim, but the crime scene had been cleaned and cleared months earlier. The hotel room had been occupied by dozens of other guests since Greg's death. Physical evidence had been lost, and the trail had gone cold before anyone knew there was a trail to follow. With the autopsy results in hand, the Beaumont Police Department faced an unusual challenge. They had a murder victim whose death had gone undetected for months. Room 348 had been cleaned countless times, occupied by numerous guests, and any physical evidence had long since been destroyed or contaminated. Detective investigations typically begin immediately after a crime is discovered, when evidence is fresh and witnesses' memories are clear. In this case, investigators had to work backward, trying to reconstruct events from months earlier with limited information and no preserved crime scene. The investigation team, led by detectives who had initially classified Greg's death as natural, had to completely reconsider everything they thought they knew about that night in September 2010. They began by re-interviewing hotel staff, looking for anyone who might have remembered unusual incidents from around the time of Greg's death. The hotel's records became crucial. Who had been staying in nearby rooms? Who had access to room 348? What maintenance requests had been made that evening? These details, which had seemed irrelevant when Greg's death was considered natural, suddenly became vital pieces of a murder investigation. One name kept appearing in the hotel's records: Lance Mueller, the maintenance worker who had been called to fix the electrical problem in Greg's room on the night he died. When investigators ran Mueller's background, they discovered his status as a registered sex offender, information that added a new dimension to their investigation. But even with this connection, the case remained puzzling. How had Greg been killed? The autopsy showed severe internal trauma caused by what appeared to be a projectile, but there was no obvious weapon. The hotel room had showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that a murder had taken place. Investigators began to develop theories about what might have happened. Could Greg have been shot? But there was no gun found, no bullet recovered, and no reports of gunshots from other guests. Could he have been stabbed? But there was no weapon and no blood at the scene that would indicate a stabbing. The case seemed to present an impossible puzzle. A man had clearly been murdered, but there was no evidence of how the murder had been committed or who had done it. The Greg Flanagan case had all the elements of a classic locked room mystery, the kind that Agatha Christie might have written. A man was found dead in a room that was locked from the inside, with no obvious signs of violence and no clear indication of how he might have been killed. For months, investigators struggled with the seemingly impossible nature of the crime. The hotel room itself provided few clues. Room 348 was on the third floor of the MCM Elegante, with windows that looked out over the parking area. The windows were intact and locked, ruling out any possibility that an attack had come from outside. The door had been locked from the inside when Greg's body was discovered, and there was no evidence that anyone had forced their way in. Investigators meticulously reviewed the hotel's security footage from that night, looking for any unusual activity or suspicious individuals. They interviewed other guests who had been staying on the same floor, asking if anyone had heard unusual noises, arguments, or signs of disturbance from room 348. The guests in adjacent rooms reported hearing nothing unusual that night. There had been no sounds of struggle, no shouting, no indications that anything violent was happening just a few feet away from where they were sleeping. This silence was as puzzling as any other aspect of the case. The maintenance request that had brought Lance Mueller to Greg's room became a focal point of the investigation. The electrical problem was well documented, and multiple hotel staff members confirmed that Mueller had been dispatched to fix it. But what had happened during those few minutes when Mueller was in the room with Greg? Mueller, when questioned by police, maintained that he had simply fixed the electrical problem and left. He claimed that Greg had been alive and well when he departed, and that nothing unusual had occurred during his visit. Without physical evidence to contradict his story, investigators found themselves at an impasse. The weapon, whatever it was that had caused Greg's internal injuries, remained a mystery. The autopsy had clearly shown that something had penetrated Greg's body with enough force to cause broken ribs, liver damage, and a hole in his heart. But what that something was, and where it had gone, remained unknown. The breakthrough in the Greg Flanagan case came from an unexpected source and in an unexpected way. After months of investigation with little progress, detectives received information that would finally crack the locked room mystery wide open. Lance Mueller, the maintenance worker who had been in Greg's room on the night he died, became the focus of renewed attention. While investigators had questioned him before, they hadn't been able to establish a clear connection between his presence in the room and Greg's death. But new information emerged that changed everything. Through painstaking investigation and possibly additional pressure from ongoing police work, the truth about what happened in room 348 finally came to light. Mueller had not simply fixed the electrical problem and left as he had claimed. Something else had occurred during those crucial few minutes when he was alone in the room with Greg Flanagan. The revelation was shocking. Mueller had been carrying a gun while performing his maintenance duties that night. This fact had never been disclosed in his initial statements to police, and it provided the missing piece of the puzzle that investigators had been searching for. According to what authorities eventually determined, Mueller had accidentally discharged his firearm while in Greg's hotel room. The bullet had traveled through the hotel's interior walls and struck Greg, causing the massive internal trauma that Dr. Brown had discovered during the autopsy. This accidental shooting explained all of the puzzling elements of the case. There had been no struggle because Greg hadn't seen the attack coming. He had been struck by a bullet fired from another room. There had been no weapon found at the scene because the gun had been in Mueller's possession when he left. There had been no obvious entry wound because the bullet had caused internal damage that wasn't immediately visible externally. But the accidental shooting was only part of the story. What made Mueller's actions truly criminal was what he did after realizing that his negligent discharge had killed someone. The most damning aspect of Lance Mueller's actions wasn't the accidental shooting itself, but his decision to cover up what had happened. When Mueller realized that his gun had accidentally discharged and that the bullet had traveled through the wall into the adjacent room, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of immediately calling for help, checking on Greg's condition, or reporting the accident to authorities, Mueller chose to remain silent. He completed his maintenance work, left room 348, and returned to his normal duties as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Greg Flanagan lay dying or dead in his hotel room, and no one knew to provide assistance. This cover-up was what transformed what might have been a tragic accident into a criminal homicide. Mueller's decision to conceal his role in Greg's death meant that crucial time was lost. If he had immediately called for help after the accidental discharge, there might have been a chance to save Greg's life. Instead, his silence ensured that Greg would not be discovered until the next morning, when it was far too late. The cover-up also explained why the case had remained unsolved for so long. Without any indication that a shooting had occurred, investigators had no reason to look for bullet fragments, test for gunshot residue, or examine the walls for bullet holes. Mueller's silence had effectively erased the physical evidence of his crime. But perhaps most troubling was the fact that Mueller continued to work at the hotel, interacting with guests and staff, knowing that he was responsible for a man's death. He watched as Greg's body was discovered, observed the police investigation, and remained silent even as Greg's family grieved his loss, believing it to be from natural causes. The psychological weight of this deception must have been enormous, but Mueller maintained his silence for months. It was only through persistent police work and possibly his own conscience that the truth finally emerged. When confronted with the evidence against him, Mueller's story began to fall apart. The details of that night in September 2010 finally came to light, revealing not just an accidental death, but a deliberate cover-up that had turned tragedy into crime. When Lance Mueller was finally arrested in connection with Greg Flanagan's death, the charges reflected both the accident and the cover-up that followed. While the initial shooting may have been accidental, Mueller's decision to conceal his involvement and his failure to render aid transformed the incident into a criminal matter. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of Mueller's actions that night. Prosecutors argued that while the shooting might have been unintentional, Mueller's subsequent behavior showed a callous disregard for human life. He had allowed Greg to die alone, deprived Greg's family of the truth about his death, and nearly allowed the crime to go unsolved entirely. Mueller's status as a registered sex offender became part of the court record, raising questions about the hotel's hiring practices and background check procedures. How had someone with a criminal history been placed in a position where he had access to guest rooms and was carrying a weapon while on duty? In October 2012, nearly 2 years after Greg Flanagan's death, Lance Mueller entered a plea of no contest to manslaughter charges. This plea acknowledged his responsibility for Greg's death while avoiding a lengthy trial that would have forced Greg's family to relive the trauma in detail. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged, with Greg's widow Susie Flanagan addressing Mueller directly. Her words captured the pain and anger that had built up over the 2 years since her husband's death. "You would never have come forward with the truth," she told Mueller in court. "You murdered him." Judge Don Wortham sentenced Mueller to 10 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the accidental nature of the shooting and the deliberate nature of the cover-up. The judge noted that while the initial discharge of the firearm might have been unintentional, Mueller's actions afterward were inexcusable and had caused additional suffering to Greg's family. The sentence was seen as appropriate by many who followed the case. While Mueller hadn't intentionally killed Greg Flanagan, his decision to remain silent had turned an accident into something much worse. Justice had finally been served, though it could never bring Greg back or fully heal the wounds left by his death. The resolution of Greg Flanagan's case brought closure to his family, but it also raised important questions about hotel security, employee background checks, and the investigation of suspicious deaths. The case highlighted how easily a crime can be overlooked when the initial evidence seems to point in another direction. For the MCM Elegante Hotel, the case was a public relations nightmare that raised serious questions about their hiring practices and security procedures. How had a registered sex offender been hired without proper background screening? Why was a maintenance worker carrying a gun while on duty? These questions led to policy changes and increased scrutiny of hotel security procedures industry-wide. The medical examiner's office also faced questions about why it had taken so long to properly classify Greg's death. While Dr. Tommy Brown's thorough autopsy work had ultimately revealed the truth, critics wondered whether the initial assumption of natural causes had delayed important investigative steps. For law enforcement, the case served as a reminder that not all crimes are immediately obvious. The locked room mystery of Room 348 had nearly become an unsolved cold case simply because investigators had accepted the most apparent explanation for Greg's death. The case emphasized the importance of thorough investigation even when circumstances seemed straightforward. Greg's family, while grateful for the eventual resolution of the case, continued to struggle with the loss of their loved one. Susie Flanagan pursued a civil lawsuit against the hotel, seeking damages for what she viewed as negligent hiring practices that had put her husband in danger. The legal battle continued long after Mueller's criminal case had been resolved. The case also became a subject of interest for true crime enthusiasts and criminologists studying locked room mysteries. The Greg Flanagan case joined the ranks of famous impossible crimes, though unlike fictional mysteries, this one had a very real and tragic outcome. The murder of Greg Flanagan offers several important lessons about criminal investigation, workplace security, and the sometimes hidden nature of crime. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates how initial assumptions can blind investigators to the truth, even when that truth is hiding in plain sight. The case shows how a lack of immediate physical evidence can allow crimes to go undetected for months or even years. If not for Dr. Brown's thorough autopsy work, Greg's death might never have been recognized as a homicide. This highlights the crucial role that medical examiners play in the criminal justice system, even in cases that seem routine. From a security perspective, the case raised important questions about employee screening and workplace safety. The fact that a maintenance worker was carrying a firearm while on duty, combined with inadequate background checking that failed to identify his criminal history, created the conditions that led to Greg's death. The case also illustrates how cover-ups often make crimes worse than the original acts themselves. While Mueller's accidental discharge of his firearm was negligent and tragic, his decision to remain silent transformed the incident into something far more serious. The cover-up not only prevented Greg from receiving potentially life-saving medical attention but also caused additional trauma to his family by denying them the truth about his death. For the hospitality industry, the case served as a wake-up call about the importance of thorough employee screening and clear policies about weapons in the workplace. Hotels began implementing more rigorous background check procedures and establishing clearer guidelines about what employees could and could not carry while on duty. The case also demonstrates the persistence required in criminal investigation. The detectives who worked the case after the autopsy results came in faced enormous challenges in reconstructing events from months earlier with limited physical evidence. Their determination to find the truth, even when the trail seemed cold, ultimately brought justice for Greg Flanagan. Beyond the legal proceedings and policy changes, the Greg Flanagan case represents a profound human tragedy that affected multiple lives in lasting ways. Greg's death cut short the life of a man who was beloved by his family, respected by his colleagues, and had much more to contribute to the world. Susie Flanagan lost not only her husband but also her sense of security and trust. The knowledge that Greg's death could have been prevented if Mueller had acted responsibly added an additional layer of grief to her loss. She struggled not only with the fact of Greg's death but with the manner in which it occurred and was concealed. Greg's colleagues and friends were forced to confront the randomness and unpredictability of violence. A routine business trip, the kind Greg had taken hundreds of times before, had ended in tragedy because of a series of unfortunate events and poor decisions. The case served as a stark reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly life can change. Even for the investigators and medical personnel involved in the case, Greg's death left lasting impressions. Detective Apple and the other officers who worked the case had to grapple with the fact that they had initially misclassified a murder as a natural death. While this was understandable given the evidence available at the time, it served as a humbling reminder of the complexity of criminal investigation. Dr. Tommy Brown's thorough autopsy work had revealed the truth about Greg's death, but it also meant that he bore the responsibility of delivering devastating news to a family that had already begun to heal from what they believed was a natural loss. The revelation that Greg had been murdered reopened wounds that had started to close. For Lance Mueller himself, the case represented the complete destruction of his life as he had known it. His moment of negligence and his subsequent poor decisions had not only killed an innocent man but also resulted in his own imprisonment and disgrace. The case serves as a powerful example of how a single moment of carelessness, compounded by poor judgment, can destroy multiple lives. In the end, the murder of Greg Flanagan was solved not through brilliant deduction or advanced forensic techniques, but through careful, methodical police work and a medical examiner who refused to accept easy answers. The locked room mystery that had baffled investigators for months turned out to have a relatively straightforward explanation, once all the facts were known. The key to solving the case was understanding that the crime hadn't actually occurred in room 348, despite that being where Greg's body was found. The real crime scene was wherever Mueller had been when he accidentally discharged his firearm, sending a bullet through the hotel's walls to strike Greg in his room. This realization explained why room 348 had shown no signs of struggle or violence, because no direct violence had occurred there. The case also demonstrates how modern hotel construction, with its thin interior walls, can create unexpected vulnerabilities. The bullet that killed Greg had traveled through at least one wall before striking him, a fact that wasn't immediately apparent to investigators who were focused on the room where his body was found. Mueller's eventual confession or acknowledgement of responsibility filled in the final details of what had happened that night in September 2010. The precise circumstances of the accidental discharge may never be fully known, but the essential facts were clear. Mueller had been negligent with a firearm, the weapon had discharged accidentally, and the bullet had killed Greg Flanagan. The resolution of the case brought justice for Greg and closure for his family, but it also served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of carrying weapons in inappropriate settings and the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions, even when those actions result in unintended consequences. Today, more than a decade after his death, Gregory Joseph Flanagan is remembered not as a victim of a locked room mystery, but as a man who lived a full and productive life that was cut tragically short. His family and friends choose to focus on the person he was rather than the circumstances of his death. Greg was a successful businessman who had built strong relationships throughout the oil and gas industry. He was a devoted husband who called his wife every night when he was traveling, a ritual that spoke to his commitment to their relationship despite the demands of his career. He was known for his professionalism, his reliability, and his easygoing nature. The case that bears his name has become part of true crime history, studied by those interested in locked-room mysteries and unusual criminal cases. But for those who knew Greg personally, he will always be remembered for who he was in life rather than how he died. The Greg Flanagan case serves as a reminder that behind every true crime story is a real person with a real life that was impacted by violence. While the mystery of his death was eventually solved, the loss of his life represents a tragedy that no amount of justice can fully address. In the end, Greg Flanagan's story is both a compelling mystery and a human tragedy. It demonstrates the complexity of criminal investigation, the importance of thorough forensic work, and the devastating consequences that can result from moments of negligence and poor judgment. But most importantly, it reminds us of the value of every human life and the ripple effects that occur when that life is lost too soon. As we close this story, we remember Greg Flanagan not as a victim in a true crime case, but as a person who mattered to those who knew him and whose life had value beyond the circumstances of his death. His story serves as both a mystery solved and a life remembered, ensuring that his memory will endure long after the details of his case fade from public attention. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Sometimes, the most haunting mysteries aren't found in dusty case files or forgotten archives. Sometimes, they unfold in broad daylight, in small Texas communities where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep and disappearances are impossible to ignore. This is the story of Lauren Elizabeth Thompson, a 32-year-old mother of 3 whose desperate call for help would echo through the piney woods of East Texas for nearly 4 years. January 10, 2019 began like any other winter day in Panola County, Texas. The morning air carried that crisp bite that East Texas residents know well, the kind that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter as you step outside. In the small community of Rock Hill, nestled among towering pine trees and rolling hills, Lauren Thompson was starting what she thought would be an ordinary Thursday. Lauren, known to some as Lauren Colvin Thompson, was a woman trying to rebuild her life. At 32, she had experienced both the joys and struggles that many young mothers face. She was petite, with shoulder-length brown hair and kind eyes that reflected both warmth and a weariness that comes from facing life's harder moments. She was a mother to 3 children, and like many parents, she carried the weight of wanting to be better, to do better, for the little ones who depended on her. Those who knew Lauren described her as someone who had been working to overcome personal challenges. She had struggled with substance abuse in the past, a battle she was actively fighting. It's a detail that would later become crucial to understanding the events that unfolded, not because it explained what happened, but because it showed her determination to change her life for her children. The morning passed without incident. Lauren went about her daily routine in the way that countless people do every day across America, checking on her children, making plans, living life one moment at a time. But by early afternoon, something had gone terribly wrong. At exactly 2:04 in the afternoon, Lauren's mother, Tori Colvin, received a phone call that would forever change their family's life. The voice on the other end was Lauren's, but it wasn't the Lauren that Tori knew. This was a voice filled with panic, confusion, and fear. Lauren sounded frantic as she spoke to her mother. The words came tumbling out in a rush, painting a picture that made little sense but felt terrifyingly real. She told her mother she was in trouble, that something was wrong, that she needed help. What struck Tori most was how disoriented her daughter sounded, as if she was struggling to make sense of her own reality. During this brief conversation, Lauren made a request that would haunt her mother forever. She asked to speak to her children. It was a simple request, the kind any mother might make when feeling scared or uncertain. But there was something about the way she said it, an urgency that suggested she might not get another chance. Lauren told her mother something else during that call, words that would later be seen as prophetic. She said that if she got out of this situation, whatever this was, she would never use drugs again. It was a promise made in desperation, a bargain with fate that revealed both her awareness of her struggles and her determination to overcome them. As Tori listened to her daughter's frightened voice, she thought she heard something else in the background, the voice of a man. It was faint, indistinct, but it was there. Whether this person was helping Lauren or posed some kind of threat would remain one of the many questions that would never be fully answered. The call ended abruptly, leaving Tori with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. 20 minutes later, at 2:24 p.m., dispatchers at the Panola County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call that would launch one of the most puzzling missing person cases in East Texas history. The caller was Lauren Thompson, and she was in distress. When the 911 operator answered, they heard a voice that was clearly in crisis. Lauren told the dispatcher that she was in a wooded area, somewhere among the dense pine forests that characterize much of Panola County. But what she said next turned a concerning situation into something far more sinister. She believed someone was chasing her. More than that, she was convinced that someone was shooting at her. The 911 recording, though never fully released to the public, painted a picture of a woman running for her life through the East Texas wilderness. Dispatchers later described Lauren as sounding disoriented and confused, struggling to make sense of her surroundings or explain exactly what was happening to her. For 20 agonizing minutes, Lauren stayed on the line with the 911 operator. During those 20 minutes, dispatchers could hear her moving through the woods, her breathing heavy with exertion and fear. They tried to keep her calm, tried to get more specific information about her location, tried to understand what was happening to her. But Lauren's responses painted a picture of someone whose grip on reality seemed to be slipping. She described being pursued through the trees, hearing gunshots, feeling the terror of being hunted. Whether these perceptions matched the objective reality of her situation would become one of the central mysteries of her case. Was Lauren truly being chased by someone with malicious intent, or was she experiencing some kind of psychological break that made her perceive threats where none existed? The call captured sounds that investigators would analyze for months afterward. There were indeed sounds of movement through brush and undergrowth. There were sounds that could have been gunshots, or could have been any number of other noises common to rural areas. There was Lauren's voice, growing more distant and frantic as the call progressed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the call ended. Lauren's phone battery died, cutting off her connection to help and leaving dispatchers with nothing but silence and an approximate location based on cell tower pings. Within hours of Lauren's desperate 911 call, the Panola County Sheriff's Office launched a search operation in the Rock Hill area where her phone signal had last been detected. Sheriff Kevin Lake, who would become intimately familiar with this case over the coming years, coordinated efforts to find Lauren before nightfall. The search teams faced challenging terrain. The Rock Hill area of Panola County is characterized by dense pine forests, thick undergrowth, and rolling hills that can easily disorient even experienced outdoors enthusiasts. The woods are crisscrossed with old logging roads, hunting trails, and creek beds that create a labyrinthine landscape where someone could easily become lost. As darkness approached on that January evening, searchers made a discovery that would provide their first clue about Lauren's whereabouts, but would also deepen the mystery of what had happened to her. They found her vehicle, a car that told its own story of distress and confusion. Lauren's car was discovered stuck in a muddy ditch along one of the rural roads that wind through the area. The vehicle appeared to have been driven off the road, though whether this was intentional or accidental remained unclear. Inside the car, investigators found Lauren's personal belongings, including items that suggested she had left the vehicle in haste. The discovery of the car provided searchers with a more specific area to focus their efforts, but it also raised new questions. If Lauren had been in her car before making the 911 call, what had prompted her to abandon it and flee into the woods? Had she been running from something real, or running from fears that existed only in her mind? Throughout the night and into the next day, search teams combed through the dense woodland. They used tracking dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers from the local community. The thick canopy of pine trees made aerial searches challenging, while the dense undergrowth limited visibility for ground teams to just a few yards in many areas. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but no trace of Lauren was found. It was as if she had simply vanished into the East Texas wilderness, leaving behind only her abandoned car and the haunting memory of her final phone calls. As the immediate search efforts transitioned into a long-term investigation, detectives began to piece together the events leading up to Lauren's disappearance. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman in crisis, but also revealed the complexity of trying to understand what had really happened in those woods. Investigators learned that Lauren had been staying in the Rock Hill area, though the exact circumstances of why she was there that day remained somewhat unclear. Some reports suggested she had been visiting someone in the area, while others indicated she might have been there for reasons related to her personal struggles with substance abuse. The question of Lauren's mental state on January 10 became central to the investigation. Family members confirmed that she had been battling addiction and that this struggle had affected her behavior and judgment in recent months. This information was crucial for investigators trying to determine whether Lauren's perceptions during the 911 call reflected actual events or were the result of impaired judgment or psychological distress. However, investigators were careful not to dismiss Lauren's claims simply because she may have been under the influence of drugs. Even individuals struggling with substance abuse can become victims of crimes, and the fear and confusion in Lauren's voice during the 911 call suggested genuine terror, regardless of what may have caused it. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate area where Lauren had disappeared. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with her in the days leading up to January 10. They looked into her phone records, her social media activity, and any other digital footprints that might provide clues about her state of mind or her plans for that day. One aspect of the investigation that proved particularly challenging was the lack of witnesses. The Rock Hill area, while not completely isolated, is sparsely populated. The rural nature of the location meant that there were few people around who might have seen or heard something unusual on the afternoon Lauren disappeared. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Lauren had chosen to disappear voluntarily. While this seemed unlikely given the terror evident in her 911 call, it couldn't be completely ruled out. People disappear for many reasons: to escape debts, abusive relationships, legal troubles, or simply to start over somewhere else. While investigators worked their case, Lauren's family lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Her mother, Tori Colvin, became the public face of efforts to find Lauren, speaking to media outlets and organizing search efforts when official resources were no longer available. The impact of Lauren's disappearance on her children was immeasurable. 3 young lives were forever changed by their mother's absence, left to wonder what had happened to the woman who had called her own mother that January afternoon, asking to speak to them one last time. Tori organized vigils and search parties, never giving up hope that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, perhaps injured and unable to call for help, or perhaps held against her will. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the situation. Without answers, hope and despair battled constantly in the hearts of those who loved Lauren. The local community rallied around the family, with volunteers continuing to search the woods long after official efforts had scaled back. East Texas communities are known for taking care of their own, and Lauren's disappearance became a cause that united neighbors and strangers alike in the common goal of bringing her home. As months turned into years, the case received periodic media attention, particularly around the anniversary of Lauren's disappearance. Each January 10th brought renewed appeals for information and renewed pain for a family that remained trapped between hope and grief. For more than 3 years, Lauren Thompson's fate remained a mystery. Her case joined the ranks of thousands of missing person cases across America, each representing not just statistics but real people with families who loved them and missed them every day. The Panola County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Cutter Clinton who had succeeded Kevin Lake, continued to follow leads as they emerged. Every few months, someone would call in with information, a possible sighting, a tip about someone who might know something, a new theory about what might have happened. Each lead was investigated, but none provided the breakthrough that everyone hoped for. The case remained open and active, but as time passed, the trail grew colder. Physical evidence, if any had ever existed beyond Lauren's abandoned car, had likely been affected by weather and time. Witness memories, always fallible, became even less reliable as years passed. For investigators, Lauren's case represented both the challenge and the heartbreak of police work. They had a clear timeline of events up to a point: the calls to her mother and to 911, the discovery of her car, the extensive search efforts. But beyond that point, they had only theories and questions. The case also highlighted the particular challenges of investigating disappearances in rural areas. The vast expanses of woodland, the sparse population, and the limitations of search resources all combined to make finding someone incredibly difficult, even when searchers had a general idea of where to look. On a summer day in July 2022, more than 3 years after Lauren Thompson had vanished into the East Texas woods, a work crew was conducting routine maintenance in a wooded area of Panola County when they made a discovery that would finally provide some answers to the questions that had haunted Lauren's family for so long. Hidden among the trees and undergrowth, the crew found human skeletal remains. The location was not far from where Lauren's car had been discovered in 2019, but it was in an area that had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation. The passage of time, the effects of weather, and the dense vegetation common to East Texas forests had kept the remains hidden until that July day. The discovery set in motion a careful process of recovery and identification. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to forensic experts who would work to determine their identity. For the families of all missing persons in the area, this discovery represented both hope and fear: hope for answers, but fear of what those answers might be. Forensic anthropologists began the meticulous process of examining the remains. The condition of the bones, the location where they were found, and any associated evidence would all be crucial in determining not just identity, but potentially cause and manner of death. The identification process involved multiple forensic techniques, but in Lauren's case, dental records would prove to be the key. Over the course of several months, forensic experts conducted detailed comparisons between the dental features of the recovered remains and Lauren Thompson's dental records. On December 13, 2022, nearly 4 years after Lauren Thompson had made her final desperate phone call, Sheriff Cutter Clinton held a press conference that would finally provide her family with the answer to one crucial question, while raising many others. The skeletal remains found by the work crew had been positively identified through dental comparison as those of Lauren Elizabeth Thompson. After years of not knowing, her family finally had confirmation of what many had suspected but none had wanted to believe: Lauren was dead, and she had died somewhere in those East Texas woods not long after her disappearance. For her mother, Tori Colvin, and for Lauren's 3 children, the confirmation brought a complex mix of emotions. There was grief, of course, for the final loss of hope that Lauren might somehow still be alive. But there was also a sense of closure, an end to the agonizing uncertainty that had defined their lives for nearly 4 years. Sheriff Clinton was clear in his statements to the media and the public that while they now knew what had happened to Lauren in the most basic sense, she had died in the woods where she had last been heard from, they still didn't know how or why she had died. The condition of the remains after more than 3 years in the East Texas environment made determining cause of death extremely challenging. Soft tissue had long since decomposed, taking with it most of the evidence that might have revealed whether Lauren had died from natural causes, accident, suicide, or homicide. The forensic examination would continue, with experts looking for any clues that the bones themselves might provide. Fractures, cuts, or other marks on the bones could potentially indicate trauma, but the absence of such marks wouldn't necessarily rule out other causes of death. Even with Lauren's remains identified and recovered, many questions about her final hours remained unanswered. The location where her remains were found was consistent with someone who had been moving through the woods in the area where she had made her 911 call, but it didn't explain what had caused her to run into those woods in the first place. Had Lauren truly been chased by someone with malicious intent, as she had told the 911 dispatcher? If so, who was her pursuer, and what had happened during that chase? The investigation continued, with detectives following up on any leads that might shed light on these questions. Alternatively, had Lauren been experiencing some kind of medical or psychological emergency that caused her to perceive threats that weren't actually present? If this was the case, had she become lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure, injury, or some other natural cause? The question of whether Lauren had been alone in those woods remained central to the investigation. The faint male voice that her mother had heard during Lauren's call home suggested that someone else may have been present, but who that person was and what role they may have played in subsequent events remained unknown. Sheriff Clinton was clear that the investigation would continue. The recovery of Lauren's remains had answered one crucial question, but it had also renewed the department's commitment to finding out exactly what had happened to her. As he told reporters, the office would be diligent in pursuing all relevant investigative leads. The case also served as a reminder of the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies across rural America. With limited resources and vast areas to cover, investigating crimes and disappearances in sparsely populated areas requires creativity, persistence, and often a significant commitment of time and personnel. Lauren Thompson's case resonated beyond the borders of Panola County, becoming part of the larger national conversation about missing persons cases, particularly those involving individuals struggling with substance abuse or mental health issues. Her story highlighted both the vulnerabilities of people in crisis and the dedication of law enforcement and communities in trying to find them. The case also demonstrated the importance of not giving up on missing persons cases, even when they seem to have gone cold. For more than 3 years, it might have appeared that Lauren Thompson would join the ranks of people who simply vanish without a trace. The discovery of her remains proved that answers can sometimes be found, even years later. For the volunteers who had searched for Lauren, the community members who had organized vigils, and the law enforcement officers who had never stopped investigating, the identification of her remains represented both success and failure. They had found her, but not in time to save her. The case raised important questions about how society treats individuals struggling with addiction and mental health issues. Lauren's 911 call had been taken seriously by dispatchers and law enforcement, but her history of substance abuse inevitably colored how some people interpreted her claims about being chased and shot at. This highlights the delicate balance that investigators must maintain when dealing with witnesses or victims whose reliability might be compromised by mental health issues or substance abuse. Taking such reports seriously is crucial, people in crisis are often more vulnerable to becoming victims of crimes, but investigators must also consider alternative explanations for what they're being told. As this story is being told, the investigation into Lauren Thompson's death continues. While her remains have been found and her family has gained some measure of closure, the full story of what happened to her during those terrifying hours in January 2019 may never be completely known. The Panola County Sheriff's Office continues to encourage anyone with information about Lauren's case to come forward. Even small details that might have seemed insignificant at the time could prove crucial to understanding what happened to her. In many cold cases, it's often a seemingly minor piece of information that provides the key to solving the larger puzzle. The case serves as a reminder that behind every missing person report is a real human being with a family who loves them and misses them. Lauren Thompson was not just a case file or a statistic, she was a mother, a daughter, and a woman who was trying to overcome personal struggles to build a better life for herself and her children. Her story also illustrates the randomness and unpredictability of tragedy. On what began as an ordinary January morning, a series of events unfolded that would lead to a mother never coming home to her children. The specific circumstances of those events may never be fully understood, but their impact will be felt forever by those who loved Lauren. For her 3 children, now years older, Lauren's story will always be part of their own stories. They will grow up knowing that their mother disappeared into the East Texas woods on a winter afternoon, that she called for help, and that help couldn't reach her in time. They will also grow up knowing that she loved them, as evidenced by her request to speak to them during what may have been one of her final phone calls. As the years pass, Lauren Elizabeth Thompson's case will likely fade from public attention, as most cases eventually do. But for those who knew her, and for the investigators who worked her case, and for the community members who searched for her, her story will endure as a reminder of both human vulnerability and human resilience. The East Texas woods where Lauren spent her final hours continue to stand, largely unchanged by the human drama that played out among the trees. The pine forests remain dense and challenging to navigate, a wilderness that can both nurture and endanger those who enter it. Somewhere among those trees, Lauren fought her final battle, whatever its nature may have been. Her case joins the long list of mysteries that have unfolded in America's rural spaces, stories of people who ventured into wild places and encountered something, whether human, natural, or psychological, that they couldn't overcome. These stories remind us that for all our technological advances and urban development, there are still places where a person can disappear, still situations where help cannot arrive in time, still mysteries that resist easy explanation. The investigation continues, as it should, because Lauren Thompson deserves justice, whatever form that justice might take. Her family deserves answers, even if those answers are difficult to hear. And society benefits when law enforcement agencies refuse to give up on cases, no matter how challenging they might be. In the end, Lauren Thompson's story is both unique and universal. It's the story of one woman's struggle with personal demons and her ultimate disappearance into the Texas wilderness. But it's also a story about family, community, perseverance, and the enduring human need to understand what happens to those we lose. On quiet nights in Panola County, when the wind moves through the pine trees and carries with it the sounds and scents of the East Texas forest, some might listen carefully for echoes of that January afternoon in 2019. But the woods keep their secrets, and Lauren Thompson's final story may remain forever among the mysteries that the wilderness holds close and never fully reveals. The case reminds us that in our interconnected world, it's still possible for someone to vanish, leaving behind only questions, memories, and the determination of those who refuse to let their stories be forgotten. Lauren Thompson's story continues, not in the woods where she died, but in the hearts and minds of those who remember her, seek justice for her, and work to ensure that her children know their mother was loved, missed, and never forgotten. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet mill city of Lewiston, Maine, where the Androscoggin River winds through brick buildings that once housed thriving textile factories, November nights carry a particular chill. The year was 2011, and for John and Jolene Turner, what began as a typical autumn week would become the beginning of a nightmare that continues to this day. Their daughter, Samantha Folsom, was 26 years old and trying to rebuild her life. She lived alone in a modest apartment on Oxford Street, in the Place St. Marie complex, one of those practical, no-frills buildings that dotted the working-class neighborhoods of Lewiston. But Samantha wasn't just surviving, she was genuinely trying to thrive. To understand what happened to Samantha, we need to understand who she was, not just the victim of an unsolved crime, but a complex young woman with dreams, struggles, and people who loved her deeply. Growing up, Samantha had been the kind of child who seemed to approach life with boundless energy and compassion. She was known as an animal lover, athlete, and devoted little sister who did everything with her older brother Jonathan. She played soccer, was a talented swimmer, and was the captain of the junior varsity cheerleading team. Friends described her as someone who would always stand up for the underdog, the kind of person who couldn't walk past a stray animal without stopping to help. But like many young people, Samantha's path through her 20s hadn't been smooth. She had struggled with substance abuse, a battle that had taken its toll on her relationships and her sense of self. However, by 2011, something had changed. Samantha had found a powerful motivation to get clean and stay clean, her 3-year-old son. She had friends and she was focused on taking care of her son. She was trying to get clean and stay clean, those close to her would later tell investigators. This wasn't just the wishful thinking of a parent struggling with addiction. Samantha had been taking concrete steps to turn her life around. She had been attending meetings, staying in touch with her support network, and most importantly, she had been consistently present in her child's life. Her parents, John and Jolene Turner, had seen the change in their daughter. After years of worry, of late-night phone calls and heart-wrenching conversations, they had begun to feel hopeful. Samantha seemed more stable, more focused, more like the determined young woman they had raised. The first few days of November 2011 passed quietly in Lewiston. The trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving the city looking stark but peaceful under the gray New England sky. Samantha had been keeping her usual routine, checking in with family, taking care of her son, maintaining the structured lifestyle that had become so important to her recovery. But then, around November 6th, something changed. John and Jolene Turner were used to hearing from their daughter regularly. It wasn't unusual for them to talk every few days, sometimes more often. Samantha had been good about staying in touch. It was part of her commitment to maintaining healthy relationships with the people who mattered most to her. When Sunday passed without a call, they weren't immediately concerned. Monday came and went. Still nothing. By Tuesday, a familiar knot of worry began to form in the pit of their stomachs. It was the kind of fear that parents of children who have struggled with addiction know all too well, the fear that silence means something has gone terribly wrong. They tried calling. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. They left messages. They called again. Still nothing. By Wednesday morning, November 9th, John and Jolene couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't like Samantha. Even during her most difficult periods, she had rarely gone this long without some form of contact. And now, when she was doing so well, when she was so committed to staying connected, this silence felt ominous. They decided to drive to her apartment. The Place St. Marie apartment complex on Oxford Street was typical of many low-income housing developments in small New England cities. The buildings were functional rather than beautiful, designed to provide affordable housing for working families and young adults trying to make their way in the world. Samantha's apartment was on the ground floor, accessible through a small entryway that led directly from the parking area. When John and Jolene arrived at their daughter's apartment, they knocked on the door. No answer. They called her name. Silence. The worried parents tried the door handle and found it unlocked. What they discovered when they stepped inside would haunt them forever. The apartment was eerily quiet. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, no signs of a struggle in the main living areas, no overturned furniture or broken items. But there was something unsettling about the stillness of the place, an absence that felt wrong. They called out for Samantha as they moved through the small apartment. The bedroom was empty. The kitchen showed no signs of recent activity. It was when they reached the small closet near the front entryway that their worst fears were realized. Samantha Folsom's body lay inside, curled up in a fetal position with her face turned away. "It felt like someone had punched me," Jolene Turner said. Their daughter was dead. The parents who had come looking for answers to their daughter's silence instead found themselves face to face with an incomprehensible tragedy. The young woman who had been working so hard to rebuild her life, who had been taking care of her child and staying in touch with her family, was gone. The Lewiston Police Department responded quickly to the 911 call that afternoon. When officers arrived at the Oxford Street apartment, they found a scene that would challenge investigators for years to come. Samantha Folsom, 26, formerly of Green, was found dead when her parents went to check on her Wednesday afternoon. The woman had been living in the apartment for at least a year, according to court records. Her parents became concerned because they hadn't heard from her for several days. From the very beginning, something about Samantha's death struck investigators as suspicious. The position of her body in the closet, the lack of obvious signs of a struggle in the main living area, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance all raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. However, determining exactly what had happened proved to be far more complex than anyone initially anticipated. The physical evidence at the scene didn't immediately point to an obvious cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no weapons left behind, no clear indicators of how Samantha had died or who might have been responsible. In fact, investigators appeared to have so little to go on, they didn't even classify Samantha's death as a murder. Initially, after Sam's death they said it was undetermined, said Dolan. This uncertainty would prove to be one of the most frustrating aspects of the case for Samantha's family. For months, they lived in a limbo of not knowing whether their daughter had died by accident, by her own hand, or at the hands of another person. The lack of clear answers compounded their grief and left them struggling to understand what had happened to the young woman who had been working so hard to turn her life around. While the Lewiston Police Department handled the initial response, the complexity and suspicious nature of Samantha's death eventually required additional resources. While from the very beginning, investigators were suspicious of Samantha's death, it wasn't until the following year that her death was ruled a homicide. The case was subsequently taken over by Maine State Police. This transition marked a significant shift in how the case was approached. State investigators brought fresh eyes and additional resources to bear on the puzzle of Samantha's death. They conducted extensive interviews with anyone who might have information about her final days. Investigators spoke with all of Samantha's neighbors, but none could provide crucial information about what had happened in the days leading up to her death. The apartment complex, while home to many families, wasn't the kind of place where neighbors necessarily kept close track of each other's comings and goings. The investigation expanded to include Samantha's friends, family members, and anyone else who had been in contact with her in the weeks before her death. Detectives worked to reconstruct her final days, trying to understand who she had seen, where she had gone, and what circumstances might have led to her death. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of a young woman who had been genuinely committed to positive changes in her life. Friends and family members consistently described Samantha as focused on her recovery and devoted to her son. There was no indication that she had been struggling with the same issues that had plagued her in earlier years. The more investigators learned about Samantha's state of mind in the weeks before her death, the more puzzling the case became. Prior to her death, Samantha was making plans to turn her life around. This wasn't just the hopeful speculation of grieving family members, it was supported by concrete evidence of the changes she had been making. Samantha had been attending support meetings regularly. She had been maintaining steady contact with her family. Most importantly, she had been present and engaged in her role as a mother to her 3-year-old son. For someone who had previously struggled with addiction, these were significant achievements that suggested she was serious about maintaining her sobriety. The fact that someone who was seemingly doing well, who had strong motivations to stay healthy and present in her life, would suddenly disappear and turn up dead raised troubling questions. Had someone targeted Samantha specifically? Was her death connected to her past struggles with addiction? Or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? These questions became even more pressing when the medical examiner's findings came back. Investigators ruled her death a homicide and believe someone killed her several days earlier. This meant that while her parents had found her body on November 9, 2011, Samantha had likely been dead since around November 6, which aligned with when her family had last heard from her. The revelation that Samantha had been murdered, and that her killer had left her body in the closet for several days before it was discovered, added another layer of horror to an already tragic situation. It suggested that whoever was responsible had taken deliberate steps to conceal the crime, possibly hoping that even more time would pass before the body was found. When investigators examined Samantha's apartment more thoroughly, they found a scene that was both puzzling and tragic. The fact that her body had been placed in the closet suggested that whoever was responsible had tried to hide evidence of the crime. But why choose a closet in an apartment where she lived alone? And why leave the door unlocked? The positioning of Samantha's body, curled up in a fetal position, could have been interpreted in multiple ways. It might have suggested that she had been trying to hide, or it could have indicated that someone had placed her there after her death. Without clear physical evidence pointing to a specific cause of death, investigators had to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness statements to piece together what had happened. The lack of obvious signs of struggle in the main living areas of the apartment was both significant and puzzling. It could have meant that Samantha knew her killer, that she had let someone into her apartment willingly, and that the violence had occurred quickly and without warning. Alternatively, it might have indicated that the crime had occurred elsewhere, and that her body had been brought back to the apartment afterwards. Each possible scenario raised new questions and required investigators to explore different avenues. They examined Samantha's phone records, trying to determine who she had been in contact with in her final days. They looked into her financial records, searching for any unusual transactions or patterns that might provide clues about her activities. News of Samantha's murder sent shockwaves through the Lewiston community. While the city had certainly seen its share of crime over the years, the death of a young mother who had been working to turn her life around struck many residents as particularly senseless and tragic. Local media covered the story extensively, hoping that publicity might generate tips or information that could help solve the case. No one has been charged in Folsom's death. Police have named no suspects. The case is being investigated by both Lewiston and Maine State Police. The involvement of both local and state law enforcement agencies demonstrated the seriousness with which authorities were treating the case. It also reflected the complexity of the investigation and the need for additional resources to pursue every possible lead. Friends and family members organized vigils and memorial services for Samantha, celebrating her life while also keeping public attention focused on the need to find her killer. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided an outlet for community grief, they honored Samantha's memory, and they reminded everyone that this was not a case that would be quietly forgotten. As weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, the investigation into Samantha's murder continued, but progress was frustratingly slow. That was November 9, 2011. More than a year later, police have yet to charge anyone with the slaying, nor have they named any suspects. For Samantha's family, this extended period of uncertainty was agonizing. They had lost their daughter in the most tragic way possible, and yet they had no answers about who was responsible or why it had happened. The grief of losing Samantha was compounded by the frustration of watching the case remain unsolved. She left behind her parents and a 3-year-old son. The impact of Samantha's murder extended far beyond her immediate family. Her young son would grow up without his mother, never knowing the woman who had been working so hard to be present in his life. Her parents would carry the weight of their loss while also dealing with the uncertainty of not knowing who had taken their daughter from them. The investigation remained active, with detectives following up on tips and re-examining evidence as new technologies became available. But as time passed, the case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case, still open, still under investigation, but without the immediate urgency that had marked the initial months after Samantha's death. Several years after Samantha's murder, her case began to attract attention from national media outlets and true crime television shows. Samantha Turner Folsom's death in 2011, the subject of Crime Watch Daily, brought renewed attention to the unsolved murder. When crime reporter Chris Hansen and his team approached the Turners recently at their Lewiston home, they were more than happy to cooperate. For Samantha's parents, media attention represented both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, they welcomed anything that might generate new tips or information about their daughter's case. On the other hand, reliving the details of Samantha's death for a national television audience was emotionally exhausting. The appearance on Crime Watch Daily helped to ensure that Samantha's case remained in the public eye. True crime television shows have the power to reach audiences that might not have been aware of a particular case, and sometimes viewers provide tips that prove crucial to solving cold cases. However, the media attention also highlighted just how little progress had been made in solving Samantha's murder. Despite years of investigation, despite the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies, despite the attention from both local and national media, the case remained as puzzling as it had been in those first days after her body was discovered. Today, more than a decade after Samantha Folsom's murder, her case remains unsolved. Her murder has baffled investigators, and it remains unsolved to this day. The questions that emerged in those first days after her death, who killed her, why, and how, remain unanswered. The passage of time has not diminished the pain felt by those who loved Samantha. Her parents continue to seek answers, hoping that someday they will understand what happened to their daughter. Her son, now a teenager, has grown up with the knowledge that his mother's killer has never been brought to justice. From an investigative standpoint, Samantha's case represents one of those frustrating situations where the available evidence simply doesn't point clearly to any particular suspect or motive. The physical evidence at the scene, while suggestive of foul play, didn't provide the kind of definitive clues that might have led to quick arrests. The witness statements and background investigation, while painting a picture of a young woman who was genuinely trying to improve her life, didn't reveal any obvious enemies or dangerous situations that might have led to violence. Over the years, various theories have been proposed about what might have happened to Samantha. Some have speculated that her death was connected to her past struggles with addiction. Perhaps she had gotten involved with dangerous people during her earlier years, and that connection had somehow resulted in violence years later. Others have wondered whether Samantha might have witnessed something she shouldn't have seen, or whether she might have had information that someone considered dangerous. The fact that her body was hidden in her own closet suggests that whoever was responsible wanted to buy time. But time for what? To flee the area? To establish an alibi? To cover up other evidence? Another possibility that investigators have likely considered is that Samantha's murder was random, that she was simply the victim of someone looking for an easy target, someone who might have thought that a young woman living alone would be vulnerable. However, this theory doesn't fully explain why the killer would have taken the time to hide her body rather than simply fleeing the scene immediately. The fact that Samantha's apartment door was found unlocked by her parents raises additional questions. Did she know her killer well enough to let them in willingly? Had someone forced their way into her apartment? Or had the killer deliberately left the door unlocked, perhaps hoping that the body would be discovered sooner rather than later? Samantha's murder had a lasting impact on the Lewiston community, particularly among those working in addiction recovery and support services. Her death served as a tragic reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by people in recovery, and the importance of maintaining strong support networks. For many in the recovery community, Samantha's story was particularly heartbreaking because it occurred at a time when she seemed to be succeeding in her efforts to build a healthier life. The randomness and senselessness of her death highlighted the reality that recovery from addiction, while crucial and achievable, doesn't guarantee safety from other forms of violence or tragedy. The unsolved nature of the case has also contributed to ongoing feelings of unease in the community. When a murder occurs and the perpetrator is quickly arrested, there's a sense of justice being served and danger being removed. But when a case remains unsolved for years, it leaves residents with the uncomfortable knowledge that whoever killed Samantha is still out there, possibly still in their community. Despite the passage of more than a decade, law enforcement officials continue to work on Samantha's case. Anyone with any information is asked to please call the Maine State Police to report any tips or information that might help solve the case. Modern investigative techniques, including advances in DNA analysis and digital forensics, continue to offer new possibilities for solving cold cases like Samantha's. Evidence that might not have yielded useful information in 2011 could potentially provide crucial leads today, as technology continues to advance. The dedication of investigators to continuing their work on Samantha's case reflects both their commitment to justice and their understanding of the ongoing pain felt by her family. Every unsolved murder represents not just a failure of the justice system, but an ongoing source of grief for the families and communities left behind. For Samantha's family, the hope for resolution remains alive even as the years pass. They continue to cooperate with investigators, to participate in media interviews when they believe it might help generate new leads, and to keep their daughter's memory alive while seeking answers about her death. In trying to understand the tragedy of Samantha Folsom's murder, it's important not to lose sight of the person she was beyond the circumstances of her death. The young woman who was found dead in her closet in November 2011 was not just a victim, she was a daughter, a mother, a sister, and a friend who had been working hard to overcome significant challenges in her life. Samantha's efforts to maintain her sobriety and be present in her son's life represented a kind of daily courage that often goes unrecognized. For someone who had struggled with addiction, each day of sobriety was an achievement. Each positive interaction with her family was a step toward healing relationships that had been damaged by her earlier struggles. The fact that Samantha was making these positive changes makes her death even more tragic. She wasn't just a life cut short, she was a life that was actively being rebuilt, a story of recovery and redemption that was interrupted by violence. Her family's memories of Samantha focus not just on her final months, but on the entirety of her life: the athletic teenager who captained her cheerleading team, the young woman who couldn't ignore a stray animal in need of help, the mother who was determined to be present for her child. These memories provide some comfort in the face of an incomprehensible loss. More than 12 years after Samantha's death, investigators continue to work on her case. While the intensity of the investigation has necessarily decreased over time, with detectives having to divide their attention among multiple cases, Samantha's murder has never been officially closed or abandoned. Periodically, investigators return to the evidence with fresh eyes or new technologies. They re-interview witnesses, hoping that the passage of time might have loosened tongues or changed people's willingness to share information. They review the physical evidence, looking for anything that might have been missed in earlier examinations. These efforts are supported by Samantha's family, who remain hopeful that someday they will have answers about what happened to their daughter. They have participated in numerous media interviews over the years, always hoping that renewed attention might generate the tip that finally breaks the case open. Samantha's case exists within the broader context of violence against women, unsolved murders, and the particular vulnerabilities faced by people in recovery from addiction. While each case is unique, there are patterns and commonalities that can help us understand the challenges faced by investigators and families dealing with similar tragedies. The statistics on unsolved murders in the United States are sobering. While the majority of homicides are eventually solved, a significant percentage remain open indefinitely. These cold cases represent not just statistical failures, but real families who continue to live with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. For families dealing with addiction, the fear of violence is often compounded by the reality that people struggling with substance abuse are statistically more likely to be victims of crime. This doesn't mean that Samantha's murder was necessarily connected to her past struggles with addiction, but it does reflect the complex web of vulnerabilities that many people in recovery must navigate. One of the most difficult aspects of unsolved cases like Samantha's is the question of closure. Can families ever truly move forward without knowing who was responsible for their loved one's death? How do communities heal when dangerous individuals may still be living among them? For Samantha's family, the search for answers has become a central part of their lives in the years since her death. While they have undoubtedly found ways to honor her memory and continue with their own lives, the lack of resolution continues to affect them in profound ways. The concept of closure is often misunderstood. Solving a murder case and seeing the perpetrator brought to justice doesn't erase the loss or eliminate the grief. But it can provide a sense that justice has been served, that the person responsible has been held accountable, and that society has acknowledged the value of the victim's life. Without that resolution, families are left to create their own sense of meaning and purpose in the aftermath of tragedy. For some, this means becoming advocates for other victims' families. For others, it involves working to raise awareness about the specific issues that may have contributed to their loved one's death. As we reflect on Samantha Folsom's story more than a decade after her death, we're reminded of both the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. Samantha's efforts to overcome addiction and build a better life for herself and her son demonstrate a kind of quiet heroism that deserves to be remembered and honored. Her death represents not just a personal tragedy for her family, but a loss for her entire community. The young woman who was working to turn her life around might have gone on to help others facing similar struggles. The mother who was so focused on being present for her son might have raised a child who would have made significant contributions to the world. These are the unmeasurable losses that result from violence, not just the immediate tragedy of death, but all the potential good that is lost when a life is cut short. At the same time, Samantha's story serves as a reminder of the importance of supporting people in recovery, of maintaining hope even in the face of significant challenges, and of the value of family connections during difficult times. Her parents' love and concern for her, demonstrated by their decision to check on her when they couldn't reach her, ultimately led to the discovery of her death and ensured that her case would be investigated. Despite the passage of more than 12 years, hope for solving Samantha's case remains alive. Advances in forensic science continue to provide new tools for investigating cold cases. Changes in circumstances may lead witnesses to come forward with information they previously withheld. And sometimes, seemingly unrelated cases provide connections that finally illuminate what happened in an unsolved murder. The Maine State Police continue to investigate Samantha's case, and they encourage anyone with information to come forward. Even details that might seem insignificant could prove crucial to understanding what happened during those final days of Samantha's life. For investigators working on cold cases, each small piece of information is potentially valuable. A witness who remembers seeing something unusual, a person who recalls a conversation that seemed strange at the time, or someone who has been carrying information they didn't think was important, any of these could provide the key that finally unlocks the mystery of Samantha's death. The murder of Samantha Folsom remains one of those cases that haunts everyone it touches, family members who continue to seek answers, investigators who have never stopped working to solve it, and community members who remember a young woman whose life was tragically cut short just as she was working to make positive changes. In the quiet mill city of Lewiston, Maine, where this story began on a cold November day in 2011, people still remember Samantha. They remember her not just as a victim of an unsolved murder, but as a young woman who was trying to be a good mother, a loving daughter, and a productive member of her community. Her case serves as a reminder that behind every unsolved murder is a real person who was loved, who had dreams and hopes, who was working to build a life worth living. Samantha Folsom was all of these things, and her story deserves to be remembered even as we continue to seek answers about how it ended. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to Samantha during those final days in November 2011. Someone knows who was responsible for her death, and why. Until that person comes forward, until new evidence emerges, until the case is finally solved, Samantha's story remains unfinished, a mystery that continues to demand our attention and our commitment to finding the truth. The clock by Samantha's bedside stopped at the moment of her death, but the search for justice continues. Her family's love for her endures. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, and her case remains open, waiting for the day when someone will finally provide the answers that have remained elusive for more than a decade. In the meantime, we remember Samantha Folsom not as a statistic or a cold case file, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose death demands justice, and whose story reminds us of both the vulnerability and the resilience of the human spirit. If you have any information about the murder of Samantha Folsom, please contact the Maine State Police. Even the smallest detail could be the key to finally solving this case and bringing justice for Samantha and peace for her family. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey into one of Egypt's most disturbing criminal cases of recent years. A story that unfolded in the upscale neighborhoods of New Cairo, where beneath the veneer of respectability, a darkness was growing that would shock an entire nation. This is the story of Karim Salim, known to many as the Fifth Settlement serial killer. In the affluent district of New Cairo, particularly in an area known as the Fifth Settlement, life moved at the pace of Egypt's emerging middle class. Modern apartments, tree-lined streets, and a sense of security that came with prosperity. It was here that Karim Salim, a 37-year-old man, had built what appeared to be a successful life. Karim wasn't your typical criminal profile. He was educated, well-traveled, and held dual Egyptian-American citizenship. Those who knew him in his professional capacity saw him as an English teacher and educational content creator who shared lessons on various subjects through online platforms. He presented himself as an intellectual, someone who had studied in the United States and returned to Egypt with the sophistication that came with international experience. But facades, as we know in true crime, often hide the darkest truths. The story begins in November of 2023, though at the time, no one could have predicted the horror that was about to unfold. In the sprawling metropolis of Cairo, with its population of over 20 million people, disappearances aren't uncommon. People come and go, lives intersect briefly and then diverge. But some disappearances leave traces, and it's these traces that eventually lead investigators down paths they wish they never had to walk. The victims were 3 women, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own reasons for being vulnerable in a city that can be both nurturing and predatory. What connected them wasn't their backgrounds or their dreams, but rather their tragic encounter with a man who had learned to exploit vulnerability with calculated precision. Karim Salim had developed a method, a routine that spoke to the organized nature of his crimes. This wasn't passion or sudden violence, but rather something far more chilling, premeditated, systematic murder that he had planned and prepared for with meticulous attention to detail. Understanding how Karim operated requires us to delve into the psychology of a predator. Like many serial killers, he had developed a specific type of victim he targeted. These were women who, for various reasons, found themselves in situations where they might not immediately be missed, where their disappearance might not trigger immediate alarm bells in the community. The investigation would later reveal that Karim used his educational background and apparent respectability as tools of manipulation. He was articulate, seemingly trustworthy, and knew how to present himself in a way that would put potential victims at ease. This is often called the mask of sanity in criminal psychology, the ability of certain killers to appear completely normal, even charming, while harboring the most violent intentions. But what made Karim's crimes particularly disturbing wasn't just the murders themselves, but what came before and after. He had transformed his home in the Fifth Settlement into something resembling a torture chamber. Investigators would later discover that he had constructed a soundproof room specifically designed for his criminal activities. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion, this was infrastructure built for sustained criminal activity. Between November 2023 and May 2024, a period of roughly 6 months, Karim's crimes escalated both in frequency and brutality. The pattern that emerged was one of extreme premeditation combined with a level of violence that suggested deep psychological disturbance. Each victim was subjected to drugging, which served multiple purposes in Karim's methodology. First, it incapacitated them, removing any possibility of escape or resistance. Second, it allowed him to maintain complete control over the situation, feeding what investigators believe was a powerful need for domination. Third, it enabled him to carry out prolonged torture without the complications that would arise from a fully conscious victim. The drugging was just the beginning. What followed was a systematic process of torture that Karim had clearly refined over time. The soundproof room he had constructed allowed him to take his time, to indulge in whatever sadistic impulses drove him, without fear of discovery. Neighbors in the upscale Fifth Settlement continued their daily lives, unaware that just meters away, unspeakable horrors were taking place. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Karim's decision to document his crimes. He recorded videos of his acts, creating a digital record of his violence that would later serve as damning evidence in his trial. This behavior suggests several psychological factors at play: a desire to relive the experience, a form of trophy-taking that's common among serial killers, and possibly the intention to use the recordings for further psychological torture of future victims or for personal gratification. As with many serial killers, it was often the mundane details that led to their downfall. Despite the sophistication of his crime scenes and the apparent planning that went into his activities, Karim made mistakes that would eventually expose him. The bodies of his victims were discovered in different locations around New Cairo, and while Karim had attempted to distance himself from the crime scenes, investigators began to notice patterns. Modern police work relies heavily on surveillance technology, and the Greater Cairo area is monitored by numerous CCTV cameras. It was through the painstaking review of this footage that investigators began to piece together the movements that connected the crime scenes. A luxury car appeared repeatedly in the surveillance footage from areas where the bodies were discovered. This wasn't immediately obvious. Serial killers often attempt to vary their methods to avoid detection. But patient investigative work revealed that the same vehicle appeared in footage from multiple locations, always around the times when the bodies were discovered or in the periods leading up to the discoveries. The car was registered to Professor Karim Salim. Once Karim became a person of interest, the investigation moved quickly. When police looked deeper into his background, they discovered several factors that made him both an unusual suspect and a particularly dangerous one. His American citizenship meant that there were diplomatic considerations to the case, and initially, Karim attempted to use this status as protection against the Egyptian legal system. But the evidence was overwhelming. When investigators obtained warrants to search his home in the Fifth Settlement, what they discovered exceeded even their worst expectations. The soundproof room was just one element of what appeared to be a sophisticated setup designed specifically for torture and murder. Physical evidence linked Karim directly to the crimes. DNA evidence, forensic analysis of the crime scenes, and the digital evidence from his recordings created an airtight case that would be difficult for even the most skilled defense attorney to challenge. During initial questioning, Karim attempted to deny any involvement in the crimes. This is typical behavior for organized killers, who often believe their intelligence and planning make them untouchable. He invoked his American citizenship, apparently believing this would provide him with some form of immunity from Egyptian law. However, Egyptian investigators were well prepared for this tactic. The legal framework was clear: crimes committed on Egyptian soil by individuals present in Egypt fall under Egyptian jurisdiction, regardless of citizenship status. More importantly, the evidence against Karim was so comprehensive that nationality became irrelevant in the face of overwhelming proof. Eventually, faced with the weight of evidence against him, Karim broke. His confession provided investigators with details that only the perpetrator could have known, confirming their case and revealing additional aspects of his crimes that might never have come to light otherwise. The confession was detailed and chilling. Karim admitted not just to the murders, but to the sexual assault of his victims both before and after their deaths. This necrophilic behavior represents one of the most disturbing aspects of his crimes and speaks to a level of psychological disturbance that goes beyond typical criminal psychology. He also admitted to creating and possessing the video recordings of his crimes. These recordings would become central to the prosecution's case, providing undeniable evidence of premeditation and the systematic nature of his violence. The videos also revealed the extent of the torture his victims endured, details too graphic and disturbing to include in any public account of the case. Perhaps most significantly, Karim's confession revealed that his crimes were part of a larger pattern of behavior that included human trafficking charges. This suggested that his criminal activities may have been even more extensive than initially believed, potentially involving other victims or criminal networks that investigators were still working to uncover. While the legal case against Karim was building, another story was emerging, that of his personal relationships and the people who thought they knew him. Criminal cases like this often leave behind a trail of psychological devastation among those who were close to the perpetrator. Karim had been married, and his wife's story adds another layer of tragedy to this case. Reports suggest that she had been the victim of domestic abuse during their marriage, experiencing firsthand the violence that would eventually be unleashed on Karim's victims. The pattern of domestic abuse is common in the backgrounds of serial killers, often serving as a precursor to more extreme violence. The wife had eventually left Karim, escaping what she described as an abusive and controlling relationship. Her decision to leave may have been one of the factors that triggered Karim's escalation to murder. Many serial killers experience what criminologists call triggering events, major life changes or losses that precipitate their first murders or cause an escalation in their violent behavior. For Karim's wife, the revelation of his crimes must have been both validating and terrifying. Validating because it confirmed her decision to leave an abusive situation, but terrifying because it revealed just how dangerous her situation had actually been. She had lived with a man capable of the most extreme violence, and her escape may have literally saved her life. The impact on families and communities is often overlooked in sensationalized accounts of serial killers, but it represents a crucial part of understanding these crimes. Every serial killer leaves behind a wake of psychological trauma that extends far beyond their direct victims to include family members, friends, neighbors, and entire communities that must grapple with the knowledge that such evil existed among them. Karim's trial began in June 2024, and it was marked by the kind of courtroom drama that often accompanies high-profile criminal cases. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the legal process in capital cases requires thorough examination of every detail. One of the early dramatic moments in the trial was the withdrawal of Karim's first defense attorney from the case. While the exact reasons weren't made public, it's not uncommon for attorneys to withdraw from cases involving particularly disturbing crimes, especially when the evidence is as graphic and comprehensive as it was in this case. Despite the strength of his earlier confession, Karim attempted to recant his admissions during the trial. This is also typical behavior for defendants facing the death penalty. However, the physical evidence, the video recordings, and the forensic evidence created a case that didn't depend solely on his confession. The prosecution presented their case methodically, building a narrative that demonstrated not just Karim's guilt, but the premeditated and systematic nature of his crimes. The video recordings, while too graphic to be shown in their entirety in court, provided undeniable proof of his actions and his mental state during the commission of the crimes. Expert testimony from forensic specialists, psychologists, and criminal investigators painted a picture of a man who had planned and executed his crimes with careful attention to detail. The construction of the soundproof room alone demonstrated a level of premeditation that argued against any defense based on mental incapacity or crimes of passion. On August 24, 2024, the court reached its verdict. Karim Salim was found guilty on multiple charges including premeditated murder, sexual assault, necrophilia, and human trafficking. The conviction on multiple counts of premeditated murder made him eligible for the death penalty under Egyptian law. The judge sentenced Karim to death by hanging, but as required by Egyptian legal procedure, this sentence had to be referred to the Grand Mufti, the country's highest Islamic religious authority, for final approval. This process, known as seeking the Mufti's opinion, is a requirement in all death penalty cases in Egypt and represents the intersection of civil and religious law in the Egyptian legal system. The Grand Mufti's role is not to retry the case but to provide religious approval for the execution based on Islamic law principles. In cases involving multiple murders with aggravating circumstances like torture and sexual violence, this approval is typically forthcoming. In September 2024, the death sentence was officially ratified, and in December 2024, the Court of Appeal confirmed the sentence, bringing the legal process full circle. Karim Salim, the fifth settlement serial killer, would face execution for his crimes. Understanding criminals like Karim Salim requires delving into the psychology that drives such extreme behavior. Criminal psychologists who studied the case identified several factors that fit common patterns seen in serial killers. The combination of intelligence and education with extreme violence is not uncommon among serial killers. Many of history's most notorious killers have been articulate, well-educated individuals who use their intellectual capabilities to plan and execute their crimes more effectively. Karim's background as an educator and content creator provided him with the communication skills needed to manipulate potential victims and the analytical thinking required to plan complex crimes. The construction of the soundproof room demonstrates what psychologists call criminal sophistication, the ability to modify one's environment to facilitate criminal activity. This level of preparation indicates that Karim's crimes were not impulsive but rather the result of long-term planning and fantasy development. The video recordings of his crimes serve multiple psychological functions for killers like Karim. They provide a way to relive the experience, which is important for individuals who are driven by the psychological gratification they derive from violence and control. They also serve as trophies, physical evidence of their power over their victims, which feeds the ego gratification that often motivates serial killers. The progression from domestic abuse to serial killing is also psychologically significant. Many serial killers begin with violence against intimate partners before escalating to strangers. The controlling and abusive behavior Karim exhibited in his marriage likely provided him with some of the psychological gratification he sought, but as tolerance builds and circumstances change, some abusers escalate to more extreme forms of violence. The Karim Salim case had a profound impact on Egyptian society, particularly in the affluent areas of New Cairo where many residents had felt insulated from violent crime. The idea that such extreme violence could exist in their midst, perpetrated by someone who appeared to be a respectable member of their community, challenged fundamental assumptions about safety and social order. Egyptian media coverage of the case was extensive, with particular attention paid to the contradiction between Karim's public persona and his private actions. This cognitive dissonance, the difficulty in reconciling someone's public image with their criminal behavior, is often one of the most disturbing aspects of serial killer cases for the communities involved. The case also raised questions about domestic violence and its relationship to more extreme forms of criminal behavior. Advocates for domestic violence prevention pointed to Karim's history of abusing his wife as a warning sign that had gone unheeded by society. This highlighted the importance of taking domestic abuse seriously, not just for the immediate victims but as a potential indicator of escalating violent behavior. For law enforcement in Egypt, the case represented both a success in terms of investigative technique and a reminder of the importance of thorough evidence collection and analysis. The use of surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and digital forensics to build the case against Karim demonstrated the effectiveness of modern investigative methods. The Karim Salim case offers several important lessons for understanding both criminal behavior and the social systems that either enable or prevent such crimes. First, it demonstrates the importance of taking domestic violence seriously as a potential predictor of escalating violent behavior. While not all domestic abusers become serial killers, the pattern of controlling and violent behavior that Karim exhibited in his marriage served as a precursor to his later crimes. Second, it highlights the role that social isolation and psychological dysfunction can play in the development of extreme criminal behavior. Karim's crimes were facilitated by his ability to operate in isolation, away from the social oversight that might have prevented or detected his activities earlier. Third, it underscores the importance of thorough criminal investigation techniques. The case was solved through careful analysis of surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and digital records. Without these modern investigative tools, Karim might have continued his crimes indefinitely. Finally, it reminds us of the importance of community awareness and the willingness to report suspicious behavior. Serial killers often operate in plain sight, relying on social politeness and the reluctance of neighbors and acquaintances to interfere in what might seem like private matters. As of late 2024, Karim Salim remains on death row in Egypt, awaiting the execution of his sentence. His case has become a reference point for discussions about serial killing, domestic violence, and criminal justice in the Middle East. For the families of his victims, the legal resolution provides some measure of justice, but it cannot restore what was lost. 3 women died horrible deaths at the hands of a man who had turned his home into a chamber of horrors. Their stories, while ending in tragedy, serve as reminders of the human cost of such crimes. For the broader community, the case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can exist anywhere, hidden behind facades of respectability and normalcy. The comfortable assumptions of safety that many residents of affluent areas take for granted were shattered by the revelation that one of their neighbors was capable of such extreme violence. The Karim Salim case will likely be studied by criminologists and law enforcement professionals for years to come, not just as an example of successful criminal investigation, but as a case study in the psychology of serial killing and the social factors that enable such crimes. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and the courage to speak up when something doesn't seem right. In a world where such darkness can exist hidden in plain sight, these may be our most important defenses. As we conclude this account of one of Egypt's most disturbing criminal cases, we're reminded that the study of true crime serves not to sensationalize violence, but to understand it, prevent it, and ultimately protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. The story of Karim Salim is a dark chapter in the criminal history of Egypt, but it's also a testament to the power of thorough investigation, the importance of justice, and the resilience of communities in the face of unimaginable evil. The Fifth Settlement serial killer's reign of terror lasted only 6 months, but its impact on those who survived, his wife, the families of his victims, his neighbors, and the broader community, will last much longer. In remembering this case, we honor not just the pursuit of justice, but the memory of those who lost their lives to one man's descent into darkness. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.